Shocking reversal, the U.S. government, particularly the Pentagon, has confirmed that drones have indeed been flying over sensitive U.S. military installations for weeks. Just why is the Pentagon now reversing course when just a few days ago the White House told us those drones are actually just manned aircraft and we, the public, are just confused? What exactly is going on, and why is the government unable to get its story straight? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about this. So, obviously, I'm not out here exactly endearing myself to the powers that be, but man, it's really hard to get a straight answer from just about anybody in power nowadays. And this is another bizarre one. I'm sorry. This is one of those stories where it's so outside of the norm that it's hard to even sort of put it all together in your mind. So the Joint Staff, this is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, this is the Joint Chief, addresses drones over New Jersey military installations. And again, this is from defense.gov. So this is an official Department of Defense website. They say, quote, in recent weeks, a number of drones have been sighted over New Jersey, prompting concern and thousands of telephone calls to report them. Some of these drones have been sighted over Picatinny Arsenal and Naval Weapons Station Earl, both in New Jersey. They added, one, this sort of confirms the existence of these drones, or at least says these drones have been sighted, right? Sometimes when, like, for example, when people talk about UFOs like flying saucers, right? They would say there are sightings of UFOs, which sort of, you notice the phrasing is just ever so slightly different, where a sighting of a UFO is not the same thing, right? Let's say somebody said, oh, I had a sighting of a bald eagle, right? But you'd go, was that an actual bald eagle? No, it was a sighting of what someone said was a bald eagle. They're different. So the fact that this isn't a sighting, this is actually the drones that have been sighted, it says that it's phrased in a way that indicates the drones exist. Again, these sort of statements are reviewed. Again, I spent 7 years at the Department of Homeland Security. These statements, written statements like this, official press releases, get very tightly reviewed for their phrasing. So, again, you can do a little bit of analysis in how things are phrased to discern what's the truth and then what's kind of the spin. So, in this write-up, they said during an on-background telephone call today, officials from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Homeland Security, FAA, and Joint Staff provided comment and answered questions from reporters about the drone sightings. A spokesman from the Joint Staff, this is the crazy part, acknowledged there had been sightings of drones over 2 military installations in New Jersey, but said such sightings are typical. They said, quote, we have confirmed sightings at Picatinny Arsenal and Naval Weapons Station Earl. They said, quote, the spokesman continued, this is not a new issue for us. We've had to deal with drone incursions. Wait. You notice they just pivoted here. The spokesman went from acknowledging that they're sightings, people saw them, to their drone incursions. There's a difference, right? If you're imagine you're a Ukrainian in position, and what's the difference between sighting a Russian tank and having a Russian tank incursion? One of those things is really happening, and one of those things is something you're seeing and think might be happening. So there's our acknowledgement. They said, we've had to deal with drone incursions over our bases for quite a time now, and it's something that we routinely respond to in each and every case when reporting is cited. This is pretty actually embarrassing. Why? Because they say, well, we respond to it. Like, that is the lowest bar for action you can take. The spokesman said the military installations have the means to detect and respond to such drones, and that security personnel are trained to identify, categorize, and employ those tools to keep drones from flying over unauthorized U.S. military bases. Which is unusual, because if those tools were effective, then why would they have routine drone incursions? And this is sort of the takeaway here, is that I want you to understand that responding to a drone is one of those things that is, again, it's the lowest possible bar. You could respond to someone breaking into your house, to use sort of this analogy. There are many responses to someone breaking into your house, including giving them all your stuff, hiding in a closet, running away in terror and leaving your family. or, of course, cowering and pleading for your life. Those are all responses. Now, are all of them equally good responses? Are all of them going to secure your person and effects equally well? No, probably not. The responses that involve calling the police or employing your own force to stop the break-in may be most effective, at least according to most, people, most like law enforcement that you talk to. And so this is kind of the thing, is when somebody says, guys, we're responding to these threats, and unless it's clear that they are actually, those responses are producing some kind of effect, you can substitute respond for look at the thing and do nothing. Why? Because again, whatever it is, they don't have an effective means for stopping it because it's a routine event, right? Which is, again, absolutely insane. And they say security personnel are trained to identify, categorize, and then employ tools to keep drones from flying over unauthorized military installations. This is a really low bar to be like, well, our response involves seeing what they are, deciding what category they are, and then maybe employ these tools, which they didn't say what the tools were, but they swear they have them, to prevent the drones from flying unauthorized over military bases, which they are unable to do, right? Now, again, to date, they say, we have no intelligence or observations to indicate that they're aligned with a foreign actor or have malicious intent. But then he continued. This is another just absolutely brilliant. But we don't know. We have not been able to locate or identify the operators or points of origin. This is exactly what I've talked about. And this is why I try to make these videos, is to sort of push the government to actually respond, to actually be held accountable for their failures. And more importantly, I care less about being like, who's wrong? I care more about actually taking action in response to a threat to our country. Again, being unable to determine the origin, this is literally almost verbatim from one of my videos. If you're unable to determine the origin or operators, how can you say definitively that they don't have foreign intent, right? Again, it's like you hear your door kicked open. You hear heavy footsteps in your foyer. Is it a case of mistaken identity? Is it your neighbor? Is it an unusually committed Amazon delivery person? Or is it a robbery? If you don't know the origin of the noises, you don't know definitively that it's not a threat. And again, if someone's breaking into your country, so to speak, you should probably assume that it's a threat, all other things being equal, given the fact that, again, flying an unauthorized drone is super illegal. I wouldn't recommend you try doing it yourself because you will get arrested. So the fact is, again, like you wake up at night, you hear the door kicked open, you hear heavy footsteps. Is your first thought, well, maybe my uncle's come to visit, right? You're like, maybe Uncle does like to come by, but the fact that he kicked down the door instead of knocking is what's sometimes called a clue. And the fact that these drones are flying with no coordination with the FAA, with no coordination with, the military, and that their incursions over these sites is itself, I don't know what else to tell you, a massive problem. And it's a sign that, to me at least, that there is some level of hostile intent. Again, if your intent is good, then why would you not get just a regular permit? Coordinate with the FAA. Just do all the right things, right? So, again, and why would you fly over sensitive U.S. military installations? Now, the military proceeds to explain the issue, which I think is fair. The military has limited authorities when it comes to conducting investigations off military installations. And this is an appropriate boundary in the United States, right? The military is prohibited from conducting intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations in the United States, which they could, in theory, use to determine the origin of who might be flying the drones. Right? So by law, and this is what you want. You don't want a country where the military has the authority to spy on U.S. citizens. That's a pretty bad no-no. Now, before we finish the rest of this, I wanted to mention two things. The first is, if you appreciate this coverage, you want to definitely hit that subscribe button. But more important than that, you may notice that I'm pretty critical of the U.S. government. I'm pretty critical of the Russians. I'm pretty critical of the FBI, the responses. And the reason I do that is because I don't have any sponsors on this channel. All right. Basically, I've had 1 to 2 sponsorships a month at most. And my rule is they don't get to dictate content. And as you can imagine, I obviously am not part of any kind of major media outlet, right? I'm entirely self-funded. Or rather, I'm entirely supported by you guys, the audience. And if you wanted to help out, you can do that over on combatvetnews.com. I try to make it worth your while. This functions like Patreon, right? A couple bucks a month. Help goes directly to me. Unlike Patreon, right? I run Combat Vet News, so there is no, you're not funding another service that takes a cut. But every Tuesday and Thursday, I find the uncensored combat footage from across the front lines, including footage sent to me by units that I have linked up with in Ukraine. And those guys will send me some of their absolutely crazy footage. We will break it down, show the tactics, the techniques, even sometimes find the location it's taking place in. And that is uncensored stuff that YouTube won't let me show you. So the link is in the description. Go to Combat Vet News and help me out here, right? Help me able to continue to do this and speak truth to power, right? So they point out that the military, correctly, I think, is not responsible for the surveillance over U.S. citizens' sites, right? But they say that's the job of local law enforcement who can conduct these kind of investigations. And this is sort of the problem, is that local law enforcement is, well, local. And what happens when you have a drone that flies in and out of the country, out across from overseas? What you end up with is a situation in which nobody's in charge of it. And the only people in charge of it, right, is federal law enforcement like Homeland Security and the FBI. And these entities, unfortunately, seem to have almost no counter-drone efforts. In congressional hearings, the FBI said we have less than $500,000 as the budget for our entire national counter-small drones effort. And this is a problem because, for context, we have raised on this channel more than that to buy counter-drone technology for the Ukrainians. So literally a YouTuber is out there raising more money to stop drones than the entire FBI, which, given their multi-billion-dollar budget, is a little super fucked up. I don't know what else to tell you here. All right? And again, the spokesman, interesting. Spokesman also said the department is frustrated with the appearance of the drones. This is pretty embarrassing. They said the main points to deter the activity using some of our electronic means that can respond to most of these small commercial systems, which is itself interesting. They call them small commercial systems, deny them access to the airspace over our bases. We don't know what the activity is. We don't know if it's criminal, but I will tell you that it's irresponsible. Here on the military side, we are just as frustrated with the irresponsible nature of this activity. Again, this is a really strange sort of context. And again, the military is not going to call these things to be irresponsible. And here's, this is not, none of this is the response that you would expect from the government if this was a classified program being tested, for example. And that's one of the leading theories here, is they say, oh, it's some sort of classified program that's like being tested. But you wouldn't target U.S. military installations, right? Where you would test, you wouldn't test them over the ocean, and you wouldn't fly in New York or other areas with large aircraft. Why? And it's not because the U.S. government just doesn't want to cause a ruckus. It's because the intelligence community, right, the CIA or DARPA, if they were to invent this kind of drone tech, what they would do is actually, what they would do is test it over large military testing grounds, because if you're not 100% sure, if you're testing a new system, particularly one with a level of autonomy like these drones seem to operate, what you would want to do then is reduce the likelihood of accidents. And so you'd want to deploy them in controlled military airspace. And remember, for context, yeah, these guys are flying in like New York and stuff, but if you look on a map, right, you can get the same sort of large-scale overhead, like you could have the same area, but in somewhere like Nevada, like Groom Lake, right? The classic Area 51, right? It's as big as, it's probably bigger than New York. It's, or bigger than Manhattan, certainly, bigger than New York City, but it's empty. There's no other flights there. There's no big cities nearby. And so the Fed, you can test your drone swarms there. So the fact that they're over New York says this probably isn't a test of a system, right? Now, I want to point out here, here's some footage coming to us that just dropped from the Capitol. You can see these drones literally flying right over the U.S. Capitol, which is some pretty eerie stuff to see. And again, pretty troubling to see these drones, again, getting just so close and so low to the U.S. Capitol. But you can see, too, that, again, people are going to say, oh, it's could be planes on approach to Reagan. And that's possible, but like at the end of the day, these seem pretty brazenly close to the Capitol, and they're pretty static, and the approach is kind of wrong. I don't know what else to tell you, right? So like, let's see here. Let's see if we can get a little context for where this thing is at. So we can see, when we'll let them zoom out, and we'll try to orient it around the Capitol steps, right? So there's the Capitol. There looks like the maybe the Eisenhower office building. So if you go on Google Maps, we can try to discern a little bit about where this is, right? So we'll go to DC, right? Okay. Here we go. Perfect. So let's take a look. So here's Reagan National, right? So here's what I want to point out. This is the closest airport, and you can see here that, yeah, you've got actually the landing right here. Here's the White House. Here's the U.S. Capitol. Right? And so the drone was right here. So actually, this wouldn't be totally crazy to say that these were aircraft on approach to the Capitol. But again, it just depends on the angle, right? If this person is filming from like Navy Yard, they could, again, be filming like right here, looking at the Capitol. Looking at the rotunda. It could be like the Rayburn building here. But, so again, it wouldn't be crazy, but what would be kind of crazy is to say, all right, all these aircraft are on approach, like, coming to Reagan. I don't know. Like, so here, but here's the tough part, right? I want to point out this. This is this is shot from an airplane in LaGuardia. Now watch this. See, this is on approach to LaGuardia as they're landing. Look at how low this drone is. This is already flying very low. Again, this is how low, I mean, you've been on a flight. You know that this is a plane sort of coming in for a landing, and you can see that this drone is just right below it. And it I don't know. I will also say, oh, sorry, let me get you guys the footage here, right? You can see, here's somebody who's like, hey, this doesn't really look like an aircraft, and you can kind of see why. That's a very weird, it's just weird. I don't know what else to tell you. So, again, it's hard to say. Each individual kind of sighting is its own animal, right? Taking a look at this again, you can see it's tough to say if this isn't an approach from Reagan. These are also two really close planes, if they are planes. They're like both approaching Reagan almost at the same time, if they were aircraft. And there's one other piece of evidence I want to share with you guys. And I won't disclose exactly who it is, but this is somebody who has an extensive military background and is very close to me, who I know is not a conspiracy theorist, is not some kind of woo-woo guy, and is someone who I really implicitly trust, especially their judgment on this sort of thing. And he talked to me the other day. He said, I saw one, dude. I saw one over my house. He's like, it absolutely was, it was about the size of a car. It was flying at about 300 or 600 feet of altitude. And he's like, you know, I rolled down my window and I heard what sounded like a lawnmower engine. And he said, he's like, this is not a standard aircraft. And this is somebody with extensive military background. This is somebody who, again, is not out here. He's never advocated a conspiracy theorist in his life. So when he told me this sort of unprompted, I was like, okay, I think there's more to this than what's going on, and now we have confirmation of that. Anyway, guys, thanks to our Colonel tier members like Bill Collier, Robert Colburn, Gars Martin, Eugenia Quester, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Carius, L90, Pecha Terror, as well as all of our Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.
This is Rocky. I guess he needed new tires. So I jumped on eBay Motors, and I saw these. eBay Motors even sent them to a local installer. Yeah, eBay.
Happiness is just a freezer away.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan podcast by night, all day.
Hello, Peter. What's going on, man? Nice to meet you.
Right back at you. It has been a crazy year.
Yeah, it's been a crazy year for everything, right?
Yeah, it's one thing when you talk about how the world's going to be coming to an end. It's quite another when it's like here and now.
Yeah. Well, you've been working on this type of material, this subject matter for quite a long time. So tell everybody your background.
Let's see. My background's in economic development. It's all about figuring out what works where and why if you try the same policies in the next town over, it's usually a disaster. And then I worked actually here in Austin at a company called Stratfor for 12 years, and I was their sole generalist. So it was my idea to kind of plug everything together and figure out what the map of the world looks like, and how if you pull a string on one side of the world, something changes on the other side.
Well, your perspective on sort of global interactions with China and Russia and the United States and the energy supply and the food supply, I have not heard before. I haven't heard it as comprehensively as I've seen you put it together, so I'm kind of excited to talk to you about this. So when, I guess we should start it with Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, you were not surprised.
Not even a little, no.
You expected this, and you felt like this is inevitable, and this is just something that was always going to happen, and it's not going to just stop at Ukraine.
No, not even remotely. The Russian space is among the worst farmland in the world, and so they've never been able to generate enough income to have a road network. Everything has to be moved by rail. And their frontiers are just huge, and they're open, and if you've got a force that can't maneuver itself, your only reasonable defense strategy is to be forward positioned and use geography to help you out. So you expand until you reach mountains or oceans or deserts, and then you anchor on either side of those and plug the access points. Unfortunately for Ukraine, there are two of those access points on the other side of Ukraine. So the Russians were always going to try to push through and retake that territory that they had controlled for most of the last 350 years. Unfortunately for them, in the 35 years since the Soviet system collapsed, the Ukrainians have developed an identity, and now they would like to be something other than a road hub.
So one of the narratives that was going around was that the reason why Russia was pushing into Ukraine is because NATO was moving their arms closer to the border of Russia.
There is something to be said for that. You just have to put it into context to really understand it. So the Russian point of view is for us to be secure, we need to expand until we reach a point where invaders cannot overwhelm us. We have to be able to plug those access points. But to give the Russians what they want, you have to sign over the future of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Belarus, Ukraine, let's go on, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, all the stands. Basically, the Russians, in order to feel safe, they have to be able to occupy total populations that are twice of their own. And I'm sorry, but that's just not feasible. So, technically, the people who claim that NATO provoked this are correct. NATO can't have what it wants in Russia in order for Russia to feel safe. But for Russia to feel safe, they've got to occupy over 180 million people. And that was never part of the game.
So what do you think they anticipated was going to happen when they started the war?
Well, I don't think it was just the Russians who anticipated it. Ukraine, the last war in 2014, basically rolled over. They proved to be militarily incompetent, they were corrupt, and they couldn't put up any sort of resistance. Crimea fell in just a matter of a couple of days. And I think a lot of us who are in the security side of things thought that this was going to be, to a degree, a bit of repeat. Now, excuse me, I was probably one of the more optimistic people for Ukraine because I had seen them develop a culture and seen them arm and train and had seen it be meaningful. But Ukraine is still a flat country, and the Russians are still one of the largest militaries in the world. So even I was saying that within 6 months to a year, this was all going to be over. But the Ukrainians have surprised to the upside, and probably most importantly, the Europeans didn't just roll over and let this happen like they did the last 7 times that the Russians have gone on the warpath since 1999. And that's changed the game fundamentally.
And when you look at it going forward, if people didn't anticipate that the Ukrainians were going to be able to fight back as well as they have, and then you look at it going forward, like where does this go?
Well, there's 2 paths here, and the problem is we haven't seen either side fight in their full glory yet, and until we have that fight, we really can't judge.
In their full glory, like meaning?
Well, the Ukrainians are the underdog, but they're in the process of rapidly arming with more and more sophisticated equipment. And by the time we get to May, they will have been able to do a lot of deferred maintenance on the equipment they captured from the Russians, which was more equipment than they started the war with. And there will be 60,000 Ukrainian troops that have trained in NATO countries with more advanced equipment back in the field. So, we get our Athens, if you will. On the other side, the Russians will have finished their second mobilization, and they will have at least another 500,000 men in the field. Now, they will be badly trained and badly equipped and badly led with low morale. But troops like that have a technical term attached to them: Russian. There's nothing about this war that is unique in Russian history. The first year is always an absolute shit show. And then the Russians throw bodies at the problem until it goes away. And in half of those wars, the Russians ultimately win. So by the time we get to May and the mud season is over, we'll have a more advanced Ukrainian force fighting a much larger Russian force. And we will get our first real glimpse at how this is going to go. And we should know which way it's going to break. Now, it'll still take time. Because if the Russians are going to win, it's going to take them a year to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses, and then they have to occupy the country, and that's going to kill a couple million people. Or the Russians are going to be able to completely break the logistical supply chains that allow the Russian troops to even exist, and we'll have 500,000 dead Russians. And the Ukrainians will be able to push the Russians out of Crimea in the east. And then we get to talk about the next stage, because this is just the opening phase of what is going to be a multi-year and perhaps even multi-decade conflict.
Jesus.
Yeah. Welcome to Russia.
So how do you think it goes? Like when May rolls around?
Yeah, ask me again in May. Right now, the balance of forces clearly are edging more and more towards the Ukrainians. They've proven to be more adaptable. When the Russians made it clear that they were going to do a second mobilization, that seemed to have broken the logjam in a lot of countries, most notably Germany. And we now have armored vehicles up to and including some light battle tanks, which I know all the tankies out there are going to hate that term. But anyway, armored vehicles that have some serious firepower are going to be coming now. The Bradleys from the United States specifically. And that is it's a tool that the Ukrainians have not had. So every time the Ukrainians have achieved a tactical breakthrough, they can only push as far as their infantry can run. Now their infantry is going to be mobile. And in a war of movement to this point, the Russians have proven that they're absolutely incompetent.
And why is that?
Part of it's graft. The guy who is the defense minister, Shoigu, he's arguably one of the least competent people on the planet. But he's a friend of Putin, and so he's been able to milk the Defense Department for everything. Best guess is that he has taken a third of the budget himself for procurement, and his flunkies have taken another third, so very little gets to the military itself.
So it's corruption.
Huge corruption. And that means no training, or if there is training, it's basically a grade. And when you're using a force that can only supply by rail, you're completely dependent upon trucks for local distribution, And that's why the Ukrainians went after the trucks with the all the javelins that they got early in the war. They didn't really go after tanks, they went after the trucks. And they destroyed roughly 2,000, maybe 2,500 of them. And that has reduced the Russian military to going back to Russia, confiscating city buses and literally Scooby-Doo vans, and bringing them back to the front. And think of a Scooby-Doo van, now fill it full of artillery shells. You know, every time you hit a bump, and that is their primary ammo supply system now. Because the rail system into Crimea got blown up, the Kerch Bridge, and what's going into the east is all under artillery range, so they have to use truck, and they're just not very good at it.
Now, for a lot of people, the big fear is that if Russia starts really getting desperate, then they use nukes.
Sure, and it would have to be very desperate. I've not been as concerned about the nuclear question as some folks, because there's really only 4 scenarios. Scenario 1 is the Russians consider throwing one against the United States. But we've made it very clear from our intercepts and our sharing of information with the media that we know exactly where Putin is at any time. We're listening to his phone calls, we're reading his emails. And so he now knows very clearly that if he throws a nuke at the United States, we're going to throw one not at Russia, we're going to throw one at him. And there's no version of this where he survives. So he has tamped down the rhetoric quite a bit since last March. Option number 2, nuking Ukraine, that doesn't make sense. They want to occupy Ukraine. You don't want to have your troops in a place that's a radioactive wasteland. There may have been a case last year for nuking Poland and Berlin and Stockholm in order to disrupt the weapons flows into Ukraine. But after the battles of Izium and Kherson, the Ukrainians have more Russian gear now than they know what to do with. It's going to take them months to bring that all online. A lot of deferred maintenance that needs to be done. And so disrupting the weapons flows no longer is a critical issue because the weapons are already there. So the only scenario I can see where the Russians would seriously consider nukes is if Ukraine doesn't simply win, but decides to carry the fight across the border into Russia proper. In that scenario, where the very existence of the Russian government is threatened, that would probably change the math. But I don't find that likely without a significant shift in mindset in Washington, because we're not just providing the Ukrainians with the weaponry and the ammo, we're providing them with the intelligence and most of the steps of the kill chain. Without that, the weapons are of limited usefulness, especially at long range. And the Ukrainians have no desire to rupture that relationship. So we're talking about a theoretical that is at a minimum 7 months away, probably further.
This whole thing is such a terrifying conflict. Being that Russia is a nuclear superpower and the history of Russian wars, I mean, it's such a long history of sacrifice and death, and it's like they're accustomed to it in a way.
Oh, we can do better than that. We can make you a lot more depressed.
Okay.
So let me give you 2 things. Number 1, the Russians are relatively casualty immune. They fight in an area where they fight with numbers. They've never been technologically advanced versus their peers. They've always just thrown bodies at it. So there has never been a conflict in Russian history where they have backed out without first losing 500,000 men. We're at about 100,000 now. We have a long way to go before the Russian military breaks.
So the Russians have lost roughly 100,000?
That's the best guess at the
How
moment.
many Ukrainians have been lost?
Probably about a third of that. But that is a third in terms of military forces. In terms of civilians, we really don't know. It could be as much as 250,000 at this point. We just don't know.
Really?
Well, the data exists on the other side of the front line. All we know are about what has happened in the territories that have been liberated. And if you think of things like Bucha and Izium, German radio intercepts told us as far back as May that there were at least 70 places behind Russian lines that had suffered massacres like like Bucha. And when we've had additional liberation since then, it corroborates that general assessment.
So
that's piece 1 that you can be a little depressed about. Piece 2, the Russians see this as an existential fight for their survival. They feel if they don't get those blocking positions, they're doomed, and they're probably right. But we now know that the Russians are fighting so badly, they're doing much worse than the Iraqis did in 1992.
Really?
Oh yeah. If we had a direct fight now between NATO and Russia, it would be 1,001 casualties. And I don't know anyone at the Defense Department who's happy about that. Because if the Russians see this as an existential conflict, and they know they can't hold a match to NATO, then nukes are their only option. So the primary reason why everyone in the West has gotten shoulder to shoulder on this is they know that if Ukraine falls and Poland's next, there will be a direct fight, the Russians will lose, and then there will be a general nuclear exchange. So there's plenty of really solid reasons to root for the Ukrainians on this one.
Jesus Christ. Now, when this whole thing broke out, what do you think the Russians expected Ukraine to just give up?
Absolutely. That's what happened in 2014 for the most part.
And what are the possible scenarios for Russia? I mean, if it seems like they're completely committed to this.
They are.
And if they don't win it,
the Russian position is that our demographic structure is in such diseased and aged and terminal decline that the Russian state will be turning the lights off sometimes between 2050 and 2070 anyway. Yeah. They've had a series of big melon scoops out of their birth rate throughout the history. World War I, World War II, the collectivizations under Stalin, Brezhnev's mismanagement, Khrushchev's mismanagement, the post-Cold War collapse. And a lot of these stack on top of each other. And the biggest one stacked on top of the post-Cold War collapse. So there are more Russians in their 50s than their 40s and their 30s and their 20s and teens. And then they lie about the data of the teenagers on down. Which means that there aren't enough Russians that have been born in the last 30 years to carry the ethnicity forward much farther. And so they're thinking if they can forward position their military and plug those gaps now with their last generation of young people, then they can kind of die on their own terms 50 years from now.
have they really thought about this in that term? Like,
Yeah, this one way or another, this is the end of Russia. The question is whether it dies in the long term on their terms or in the shorter term when they're completely unmoored. Because if they fail to secure those borders, then they've got a 2,000-mile open border with countries they consider to be hostile, and they have no way of moving troops around in a way that would allow them to defend it. They'd just be waiting for somebody to come over and knock them over.
and you believe that they're aware of this, that they can't survive past 2050, 2070,
Right.
whatever it is?
I think that's what's been driving them, because 2022 was the last year where they had a sufficient number of people in their 20s to even attempt this. So from my point of view, not only did the war always have to happen, it always had to happen by now.
Jesus. Now, is this just because of the nature of a dictatorship that's run by someone like Putin, that it's just completely mismanaged because he's just dominated the power structure and made sure that everybody falls in line with his ideology and his reign? Like, what caused all this to be so poorly managed?
Well, Russia has always been poorly managed and authoritarian. But under Putin, it's taken a much darker turn because of the nature of the end of the Cold War. If you remember back to 1982, there was a coup in the Soviet Union. And Chernomyrdin and Andropov and Gorbachev were FSB, well, then KGB agents who basically overthrew the old system of Brezhnev and took over and tried, because they were the only ones who really had a full understanding of what was going on. They controlled the